Okay, it's just after 6 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, formally get started. So good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the Charleston County Public Library. My name is Nic Butler. I have the honor of being a historian for the Charleston County Library System. And I try to use Charleston's rich, deep history as a means of engaging the community's imagination. So a few months ago, when I was planning, actually before I planned this program, I was talking to my friend Janet Siegel, who's here in the audience, and we were talking about Clemson's new program at the Old Navy base. They have a wind turbine test facility. And we were talking about that, and because I happen to squirrel away odd anecdotes about low country history in my brain, I said, you know, there were windmills in Charleston 300 years ago. Windmills were once a common sight in South Carolina. And the response I got was, wow, I'd like to know more about that. And I said, you know, I'll do a program about that. So we scheduled this program for January, and then there was that ice storm that we'd all like to forget. And this program got postponed, so here we are tonight in April to talk about windmills in early South Carolina. And I found an awful lot of information, more information than I ever thought I would. And windmills were definitely part of early South Carolina history. But then again, all of the original 13 colonies of the United States had windmills as well. So I just want to take South Carolina as an example and look at how windmills played a part in our history and how we can put them into a historical context and see how the future is kind of, or how the present is really coming back to the past in our windmill roots and wind power roots in South Carolina. So what's new is old, once again. So I found an awful lot of stuff, and really there should be a part 1 and part 2 in this. I've been struggling to try to bring this down to a reasonable outline. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about some quick facts about windmills, because many of you, like myself, probably didn't know that much about windmill technology, and I want to bring everybody up to speed. And then we're going to talk about types of windmills, because windmills comes in all shapes and sizes, but there are really 3 main types, and I'm going to talk about those. I'm going to do a real quick survey of windmills in early America, just to prove that South Carolina was not alone in having windmills. And then we're going to talk specifically about some of the windmills in early South Carolina. We don't have time to talk about all of them, but I'm going to give you a few representative examples. For example, the Windmill Point on James Island, named for a windmill. And then a windmill that happened to be at White Point on the Charleston Peninsula. And then we're going to talk about the windmill at Cape Romaine, which I encourage you all to visit sometime. And then I'm going to come back to the Charleston Peninsula and talk about the last of the windmills that I've been able to find history of in South Carolina. So let's get started. Quick facts about windmills. Some things that I didn't know. You know, I'm not a molinologist, but here are a few things that we all should know. Windmills, whether it's a modern wind turbine or a 300-year-old Dutch windmill, they're all turbines, that is, things that spin, using kinetic energy, the energy created by movement of the water or the wind or a draft animal. Think about a mill with a horse attached to it going around in a circle. They transform kinetic energy into work for human beings. So, what kind of work? Well, grinding. I think everybody's knee-jerk reaction is you think about windmills being used to grind grain. And that is one, but certainly not the only use. And think about grinding, think about Barbados and Jamaica. They have windmills, they don't grind grain, they grind or press sugar cane. So that's where your rum comes from windmills. Pumping. Dutch engineers, and really the Dutch were the leading technologists in this windmill technology 300 years ago. Dutch engineers were using windmills to help pump water out of low-lying wetlands to create arable farmland. So think about the lowlands, the Netherlands. They've got low-lying areas, just like the coastline of South Carolina. Windmills help to make that land dry and usable for farm purposes. And then sawing. And I really never thought about this until I started studying South Carolina's history. Windmills can be used to take that kinetic energy and through cams and shafts and rotors, take that energy and turn it into powering vertical saw blades, not rotary saw blades, but vertical saw blades for sawing timber. And as a matter of fact, it turns out that most of the windmills in early South Carolina were used for sawing timber, not for grinding grain. In New England, they grew a lot of wheat and barley and so forth, and they exported it to places like South Carolina. In early South Carolina, we're not growing barley and wheat and those kind of grain crops because it's cheaper to just import it from New England while we're growing rice and then later cotton here. So there's more money to be made in South Carolina by growing rice and later cotton. So we're not growing so much grain, we're not grinding so much grain here in South Carolina. But grinding, you can also grind corn and make cornmeal. And you think about hominy and grits in South Carolina, okay? You know, that's something that you could do on a small scale with a mortar and pestle, or on a large scale, you could do that with a windmill or a water mill. The Latin word, a little bit of a language lesson here, the Latin word for mill is molina, like that actor, Alfred Molina. Molina. So in Europe, you will find a variety of words for mill that are derived from the Latin molina. Like in French, you have moulin. The Moulin Rouge is the red windmill. It was a dancing establishment in Paris. We have a Moulin Rouge that's now defunct on Ashley Avenue in Charleston. That's the red windmill. So if molina is the Latin word for windmill, then the study of windmills, or mills in general, is molinology. And I'm not really trying to become a molinologist here, but I encourage you to learn more about windmills, to appreciate their technology. So if you're a windmill fancier, not necessarily a molinologist, not an expert, but a windmill fancier, you and I become molinophiles. So I've had a good time studying mills and windmill technology in South Carolina. It's really more interesting than I ever imagined because windmills were and are high tech. Now think back 300 years ago when South Carolina is in its very earliest days of settlement. There isn't much in terms of what we would call technology. Sailing vessels coming from Europe to the New World are pretty high-tech machines for that time, 300 years ago. But so are windmills. They took the latest technology and the latest arts, or artifices, as they would have called them. Blacksmiths, timber framers, all kinds of artisans contributed really specialized parts to windmills. And I found a great website, lowtechmagazine.com, and kind of celebrating what we now consider low-tech machinery, like windmills, and how they're kind of making a resurgence in a high-tech form. And the image that you see on the left is kind of a cutaway frame of a windmill, and that's actually a sawmill. I don't know if you can see the logs that are being sawed by vertical saw blades there. It's pretty complicated stuff with all kinds of gears and cams and levers, and there's an awful lot of science and mathematics that went into the construction of it, an awful lot of artistry. And in the image that you see on the right, this is the inside of a working windmill in Holland, and you can see hand-carved wooden gears and wheels. This is pretty complicated stuff for the technology of 300 or 400 years ago. And in our library's collection, we are lucky enough to have a 1734 edition of Johann Zill's book, Theatrum Machinarum Universale, or, as we would say in English, the Great Universal Mill Book. It's printed in Amsterdam in December of 1734. We have a second printing of the first edition upstairs. And this is an instruction book in Dutch, because the Dutch were the leading windmill manufacturers in Europe at the time. They're exporting that technology around the world. It's a book about how to build all different types of windmills. And it's got 61 plates in it that show you how to construct all of the three varieties of the three main types of windmills. And I'm going to get to those three main types of windmills. Let me just give you an example of what Jan Ziel's illustration looks like. Here's just one from the top to the bottom. Pretty high-tech framing. I'm going to go back to the top of it. There's an awful lot of science, an awful lot of math in this. This is not child's play. These are not toys. These are serious machines. These machines represent a great investment of time and money and expertise. And exporting that technology to the New World, to places on the frontier like colonial South Carolina, was quite a feat, and it was quite a costly venture, much like Clemson University's new wind turbine test facility is a very, very costly, high-tech venture. And here's another plate from Jan Ziel's book, 1734. It gives you very precise measurements and diagrams for creating those intricately placed gears. This is all to be carved out of wood, or if you're really, really keen on investing a lot of money, this could be forged from iron. And I'll give you an example of exactly that shortly. But all the instructions, all the diagrams that you would need to create any type of windmill, all contained in this great windmill book. Moving right along, there are three main types of windmills. So you've seen photographs, you've seen drawings, illustrations of windmills throughout your life. And you've noticed that they come in all types, all sizes, shapes. They're really just three main types: post windmills, smock windmills, and tower windmills. Let me give you an example of each of those, because here in South Carolina, we had all three types. One's not necessarily better than others, they're just different construction types. So first of all, the simplest kind is a post windmill. And this is a photograph I took a few years ago at Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, so-called Robertson's Windmill. Since I took this photograph, they dismantled it and put it in storage. But this is a good example of a post windmill. So let's examine the parts and pieces of a windmill. So you're going to be a Molinologist by the time you leave. So on a post windmill, you've got basically a two-story house. It's got a little gable roof on it. It's a two-story structure. Nobody's living inside this. Don't worry about that. But it is a two-story structure. And it has four arms, or blades, as they're sometimes called. And on those blades is a frame. And in this case, it's a 26-foot long frame on which you would stretch and attach a linen sail. So without the sail, it doesn't turn, which is why they've got the linen off of this thing, to keep it from turning. But once you put the linen on there, it acts like a sail, and it turns the blades. And those blades are attached to a central shaft. And that shaft, of course, goes into the building where it's intersecting with the wheels and the cogs and turning the machinery. And just in terms of scale, I want to point out in this cute little photograph that there's a little bird sitting there on one of the frames, give you an idea of the scale of this thing. This, if you look at the main shaft in the center, that is a big timber frame shaft and timber frame arms. So that's probably a 12-inch by 12-inch beam that's used for that main shaft. It had to be hewn by human hands in order to fit this. So a lot of great skill went into this. At the bottom of the windmill is a post, and that's why it's called a post windmill. So the two-story house is sitting on a shaft. It's actually connected by a rack and pinion system. So you might think of the rack and pinion system in your car as being kind of 20th century technology. But we're talking about wooden rack and pinion connections to enable that house to sit on that shaft and be able to turn 360 degrees. And how do they do that? Well, how do they keep it from toppling over? Well, if you look into the background, there's an armature that protrudes out the back and attaches to a wheel, and that wheel is used so you can move the house around to point the blades into the wind. And of course, how do you access the machinery inside? Well, you've got to go up a flight of stairs, and those stairs are attached to the house, and they swivel with the wheel as well. And for those of you who are looking very carefully, you'll notice down at the bottom of the screen, if you have a windmill, you've got to have the bucolic sheet to go along with that. They're resting in the shade there. And next to that sheet is a grindstone. Here's a better picture of the grindstone. Those grindstones indicate that this post windmill, like most post windmills, is being used for grinding grain or perhaps corn. But the windmill, the grindstones do not attach at the bottom, they go inside the two-story house. And let me show you another cutaway. This is an illustration from an English book about windmills, which I have upstairs. This is a cutaway of a post windmill, and you see on the center there are two sets of grindstones, and I've zoomed in on that so you can see there are actually two sets of grindstones. So in the upper floor of this post windmill, you can go in there and deposit the grain between the grindstones, and the ground material will drop out the bottom, and then someone will be in the bottom story collecting and bagging up that grain. So it's a pretty efficient machine. It's doing an awful lot of work. So it's a time-saving, high-tech device for colonial America. The second type of windmill, slightly more complicated, is called a smock windmill because it supposedly resembles a smock or an apron that an artisan would wear, you know, kind of a coverall if you're painting or doing trade work, and like an apron that goes from your neck to your knees or something like that. And here's a smock windmill in Denmark. This is a late 19th century windmill. And here's another one, good example, beautiful photograph as well. This is a smock windmill in Woodchurch, England, that I found on the internet. And this is a good example of the typical features you would find on a smock windmill. They usually have an octagonal house. It's a timber frame house covered with wooden clapboards, usually octagonal, sometimes it's hexagonal. And then above that, the octagonal house does not move, like in a post windmill. The octagonal house in a smock windmill does not move, but above that, there is a cap that is on a rack and pinion system, and the cap swivels. And how do you keep the blades faced into the wind? Well, there is a rear or end rotor, just like on a modern helicopter, to keep the blades, the main blades, facing into the wind for maximum performance. And here's a great illustration that I just had to show you. Things you find on the internet. This is from a 1925 book called The Romance of the Nation. It's titled A Smock Windmill in Stuart Days. So that would have been early 17th century England. And it's a cutaway showing you all the machinery at the top of the smock windmill. And then below that, you have some working space, and there's a hopper. So again, this is used for grinding grain. And this one has 3 levels and all kinds of work going on the ground level of that as well. Smock windmills may or may not have what's called a stage. And if you look at the image on the left, you will see there's no stage. In the image on the right, there is a stage. And that's like on a ship. You would see way up in the mast a reefing stage where you can access the sails. So you think about it, how are you, if you need to trim the sails or fix the linen sails, how do you reach them? You either have to have the windmill low enough to the ground to be able to reach the blade, or as you see on the right, you have to have a stage way up in the air where you can reach the end of the blades. And in very tall smock windmills like you see on the right that have a stage, frequently there are living quarters below the stage. So just like in a lighthouse, you could have work upstairs and residence downstairs. The third and last type of windmill is a tower windmill. Tower windmills are like smock windmills. They have a stationary base. The tower windmills, that base is made out of stone or brick, like this one that you see in Tasmania. Otherwise, they're just like a smock windmill, where they have a movable cap at the top, and in all other respects, they're very much the same. And so when you think about windmills, you think about the novel Don Quixote tilting the windmills of La Mancha. These are the windmills of La Mancha, Spain, facing the ocean and catching the breeze. These are very characteristic Spanish tower windmills. They don't taper the base from the base to the top of the tower. It's not tapered like the one I just showed you in Tasmania. And they're whitewashed. And you would see almost exactly the same kind of windmills in Greece. But these are the legendary windmills of La Mancha. What about in early America? What kind did we have outside of South Carolina? Well, we had all 3 types. But the earliest windmill that we know of in America resembled the one that you see on the right. That's a reproduction of the first windmill at Flowerdew 100, which was a plantation in Virginia, erected right around the year 1621, give or take a little bit, by then Governor and Captain General of the colony of Virginia, Sir George Yardley. And this is a reproduction that was done in the past 20 years, I believe, and placed for public viewing at Flowerdew Plantation in Virginia. And of course, it's a post windmill. The earliest windmill is the simplest technology used for grinding grain. If you would like to visit this windmill, it's no longer in Virginia. It has been disassembled, packed up, and moved to Lubbock, Texas. Why Lubbock, Texas? Because the American Wind Power Center and Museum is in Lubbock, Texas. And I encourage you to check out their website. They've got a great collection of windmills. If you're a real Molinophile, you need to go to Lubbock. Or at least visit their website, windmill.com. Lots of good information. And that's a fabulous windmill there. And they've got wonderful detailed photographs of the Flowerdew 100 windmill on that website. So if you're interested in more, check out windmill.com. But like I said a moment ago, every one of the early colonies in America had windmills. And this is, I wanted to find a North Carolina example. Here's one from the North Carolina collection at the University of North Carolina. A windmill, of course, it's a post windmill at Harker's Island in Carteret County. So again, on the coastline, facing the water, catching those ocean breezes to do work with kinetic energy. And what about Barbados? South Carolina and Barbados had a lot in common, very closely connected in terms of economy in the colonial period. They had windmills in Barbados and in Jamaica and in Curacao. Think about the Dutch West Indies. Of course they had windmills. And in Jamaica and Barbados, they're getting that Dutch technology and using it to grind sugar cane to make rum. And before I leave this photograph, I want to point out that is a tower windmill using stone to create the tower itself. But everything else is made of wood. Look at those long arms and those frames made out of very large pieces of wood. And that armature coming out the back with the wheel attached to it. In Jamaica and in Barbados, in the 18th century, they had a wood shortage because they cut down all the trees to grow sugarcane. So from the earliest days of Carolina, we're shipping timber of all types to the West Indies to help them build things. So the timber for this Barbadian sugar mill may have come from South Carolina. I'll come back to that thought in just a moment. And of course, you think about the Dutch in early America, you think about New Amsterdam, which became New York in 1663. This is a 1660 illustration when it was still called New Amsterdam. And I want to point out that if we zoom in and look at the fort, that's Lower Manhattan, that's the Greenwich Village area, that's the lower west side. Facing the Hudson River, next to Fort Amsterdam, is a windmill. And of course, if we zoom in, we can tell, even though it's a little fuzzy here, it's definitely a post-windmill. Even Philadelphia and New Jersey had their windmills. And here's an illustration published in 1768, an east prospect of the city of Philadelphia. So we're looking actually at Philadelphia across the Delaware River from New Jersey. And let me zoom in a little bit on the coastline here. Let's play the game of find the windmill. You see the windmill? Give you a second. The windmill is over on the far left. So it's actually on the New Jersey side. It's actually in Camden, New Jersey. And if we zoom in on that, and I'm going to switch to a different edition of this that's actually colorized, that's the windmill being illustrated in 1768. And you see next to it there are two numbers, the number 14. So that's keyed to a guide of text at the bottom of the illustration. Number 14 is the corn mill. So this is for grinding corn mill, for making grits in New Jersey in 1768. So if you look around the American, and we could go on for a while looking at all the different windmills that survive in New England, if you look at all the American colonies, there were windmills everywhere because people imported that technology because it was very useful, high tech at the time. So just one more, in Massachusetts, there are actually surviving 18th century windmills still in Massachusetts, and this is in Brewster, Massachusetts, the Higgins Farm windmill. And of course, what type of windmill is it? No, it's a smock windmill because it's covered in wood. It's got a timber frame, it's covered in wood, and it's got a movable top. And you see the armature coming out the back, going to a wheel at the bottom, so we can keep it turned into the wind. It's still a functional windmill, 2 stories in height. So many of them in New England survive. We don't have any surviving windmills in South Carolina because we have things like hurricanes and earthquakes here. So no surviving windmills. But let me just give you a brief tour of some of the ones that did exist at one point. The earliest evidence we have of a windmill is on this plat that's dated 1680. And I apologize, this is a black and white image of a highly colored plat. The original is hanging in a frame on the wall at the South Carolina Historical Society, a fireproof building on Meeting Street. And if you haven't been there, I encourage you to just walk in and ask to see the Joseph West plat. Now this is a plat that was surveyed and illustrated by Maurice Matthews, an important South Carolina figure in the early days of the colony. And it's a plat of land that's being granted by the Lords Proprietors of South Carolina to Governor Joseph West in 1680. Joseph West is the one who led the first fleet of Europeans who settled in the Charleston area in 1670. And this is just part of his reward. And of course, you can't see the windmill. Let me zoom in a little bit. I'm actually going to rotate this 90 degrees and zoom in at that central square. And in the center of the screen, if you look hard, you can see the post windmill. So we have to ask ourselves, was Maurice Matthews drawing a windmill that existed on this property in 1680, or was he merely illustrating what this plantation tract could become once Governor West cultivated? And the answer is unknown. We have very sparse records from that time period, from 1680. So early South Carolinians are certainly aware of windmill technology and are wanting to bring that with them, even if they haven't already brought it with them by 1680. The earliest solid evidence we have of the existence of a windmill is Windmill Point on James Island. Anybody heard of Windmill Point on James Island? A couple of people, okay. Windmill Point is a place that you and I today would call Fort Johnson. You know, the place that's at the end of Fort Johnson Road. It's now a scientific research facility run by the College of Charleston and the government entity known as NOAA. But long before NOAA and the College of Charleston, back in 1694, remember that date, 1694, the Lords Proprietors back in England are sending correspondence, sending letters over to their agents here in the Charleston area. And they ordered that a grant of land be made to John Boone. John Boone already lives on James Island, or what we call James Island. He's already got a bunch of land, but they're giving John Boone more land, 100 acres of land, on condition that he have a sawmill erected and fully to be completed within 2 years. Doesn't specify windmill, does it? Just says sawmill. Sawmills, if you have a windmill that's used for sawing, it's much more complicated and much different technology than a simple post windmill. So this is a bigger investment. So he can have an extra 100 acres. John Boone owns so much of James Island that is frequently in his day called Boone's Island. So 2 years later, remember that 2-year condition, 2 years later, this map is published in Europe, the so-called Mortier map. It's actually published in French. And what we're looking at is the Carolina coastline, and I'm going to zoom in on Boone's Island, which you and I call James Island. And if you look at Boone's Isle there, and I'm going to zoom in because you can see there are lots of names of settlers living in that area in the 1690s. If we zoom in at the easternmost corner of Boone's Island, we see there's the windmill, and a cute little illustration of a post windmill at the kind of the northeast corner of Boone's Island. So how do we know that that windmill got built? Well, it's shown up on the illustration, but a couple of years later, in South Carolina government records, the South Carolina Commons House of Assembly, that's the House of Representatives today. In 1703, the South Carolina Commons House of Assembly considers ways to make Charlestown more secure from Spanish invasion, because at this time in 1703, we were seriously worried about the Spanish down at St. Augustine attacking Charleston. And so they decide that an enclosed fort, be built on Windmill Point for the security of Charleston. Windmill Point's not on the peninsula, it's over there on James Island. And how do we know that? Because in 1708, just a couple of years later, the South Carolina legislature passes an act for the building of a fortification on Windmill Point and to bar up and lay booms across the channel of the Ashley River and other things to prevent any kind of enemy warships from sailing into Charleston Harbor. Unfortunately, the text of this act does not survive. We have the title of the act, we know it was passed, we don't have the text of it. But just a couple of years later, actually just the very next year, this new thing called Fort Johnson, or Johnson's Fort, appears in legislative records, and it starts appearing on maps on James Island. So Windmill Point is the site of Fort Johnson on James Island. So further confirmation, the Crisp map, so-called Crisp map that Edward Crisp in London published in 1711, contains the first printed map of the peninsula of Charleston over on the far right-hand side. It shows the coastline of Carolina and a little bit of the Gulf of Mexico at the bottom of the screen, and an inset there that shows the peninsula of Charleston. So I'm going to zoom in on that. So this is the first printed map of the peninsula, but if you look at that carefully, it shows on the left side of the map, it shows James Island as well. And there's a triangular feature there that's labeled Johnson's Fort. And that's right where Fort Johnson is today, at the end of Fort Johnson Road on James Island. The fort evolved over the course of the 18th and 19th century, and the fort is completely gone today, covered with buildings, scientific research buildings. But if we back out to the Crisp map of 1711, I want to zoom in on Boone's Island. Again, it's showing the coastline, and if we zoom in where that circle is on Mr. Boone's Island, it looks almost identical to that 1696 Mortier map, but it shows the windmill right next to what is Fort Johnson, that triangular feature. So the windmill was somewhere perhaps a little bit to the east of Fort Johnson. Well, what does that look like today? If you were to take a sailboat in Charleston Harbor and try to find that. Well, let's orient ourselves here. Charleston Peninsula, the top of the screen. The bottom left, that's James Island. And at the top right, that's Mount Pleasant and Sullivan's Island. And if we zoom into that circle, that's where Fort Johnson is. Fort Johnson on the Ashley River, just a little bit down the river from Fort Sumter. So somewhere in between those features maybe is where the windmill. There's not very much high, dry land there, but of course sea level is 3 feet higher today than it was in 1708 when that Fort Johnson got started. So the windmill the foundations of the windmill may still be out there somewhere. I don't think anybody's ever bothered to look for it because no one knew what to look for. So maybe that's the beginning of another archaeological search. But along the search for documentary evidence, I found evidence that there was once a windmill at White Point, the southernmost tip of the Charleston Peninsula. And let me tell you how I know that there was a windmill there. Even there, there's no marker, there's no evidence of it today. A few pieces of evidence. In June of 1712, Carolina Colony is doing pretty well in 1712. The legislature passed an act for the better strengthening of this province by increasing the numbers of inhabitants thereof, and for encouraging the making of potash, building sawmills, and other mechanic engines. So we wanted to increase the artisan population of South Carolina. Large numbers of slaves have been brought into Carolina by this time. By 1712, the population of South Carolina is predominantly enslaved Africans. So we need to bring in more white Europeans, is what they're saying. And we need to bring in people who have trade skills, who can build and create industry here in South Carolina. So it's kind of an industrial incentive from the government, much like what we think of today. And in this act, there are many sections. Section 13 encourages settlers, quote, to erect a mill to saw with the wind or water so as to bring the same to complete perfection as in Holland or in other countries. So they're clearly saying, get somebody over here who can build Dutch windmills or Dutch water mills. And Section 14 encourages settlers to erect wind or water mills for grinding wheat, barley, and Indian corn. And as I've said already, South Carolinians really didn't get in line with that one because it became easier just to import wheat and barley from the northern colonies. And we could grow plenty of corn here and make our own grits. Thank you very much. So you think about grits as a tradition in South Carolina, as a culinary tradition. Well, that's hand in hand with windmill technology. So did windmills get built after this act was passed in the summer of 1712? There's no direct evidence until about 20 years later. Now let me show you that evidence first. In February of 1736, back in England, there are a couple of South Carolina investors, Samuel Wragg, who goes back and forth between London and Carolina, and Samuel Dean, who's a merchant in London. And they are submitting a petition to the Board of Trade in England, and they're asking for some financial assistance. They're asking for a government bailout, basically. And they're saying, in 1713, Wragg and Dean and several others, they formed a little co-partnership, in South Carolina, did actually spend 1,500 pounds sterling. That's a huge sum of money 300 years ago. In transporting about 30 artificers from Holland, that is 30 windmill specialists coming from Holland to South Carolina in 1713. And they contracted to serve for 2 years and build windmills. But the Indian War, the Yamasee War that broke out in 1715, kind of ruined the plans. The said artificers by 1715 had actually built one sawmill to go by wind. It's a long way of saying it's a wind-powered sawmill somewhere in South Carolina. But I think it was right here on the peninsula, which frequently worked with 6 saws at a time. That may sound kind of outrageous. 6 vertical saw blades moving at the same time. But actually, if you look at Dutch sawmills from the same time period, that's just status quo. In fact, I've got some photographs of wind sawmills that used 6 blades at a time. With 6 blades, you can shove a tree in one end and get planks for a building out the other end. It's really efficient technology. So they had not been, those artificers, those 30 Dutch artificers, had not been taken away by the then governor at the time, that would have been Governor Craven, to serve in the war. And if they had not been taken away, they would have erected 2 more windmills. But the Yamasee War broke out in 1715. Every able-bodied white man, including those 30 Dutch artisans, were drafted into the South Carolina militia to fight the Indians in 1715 and 16. If they had not done that, they would have built more windmills. But being foreigners at the time, for which they contracted expired. So their 2-year contract expired at the end of the war. Most of them would not stay any longer, by which means they have suffered a great loss. So Samuel Wragg and Samuel Dean are asking for a government bailout. They tried this multinational investment scheme to bring this technology to South Carolina. They built 1 sawmill, and then the whole scheme fell apart. How do we know where they built that sawmill? Well, here's the evidence I found. In this government discussion in January of 1727, Colonel William Rhett, that's Colonel Rhett the Jr., not the one who captured Blackbeard, he's on a committee of fortifications for the town of Charleston, and he reports to the South Carolina Commons House of Assembly. For the better to secure this town and to prevent an enemy landing, the committee are of opinion that a battery, that is a gun battery, be erected on the point near the windmill to mount 10 of the best guns. Where is that point? What is he talking about? The point he's talking about recommending to build a battery of 10 large cannon at some point near the windmill. Is he talking about James Island? No, at this time there's already a closed fort over there, not a battery. So they've already got cannon mounted at Windmill Point on James Island. And my conclusion is that this point we're talking about is White Point. And if we skip ahead to 1734, there's another legislative discussion. Colonel Othniel Bale from the Committee on Fortifications reports similarly to the South Carolina Commons House of Assembly, and he says, your committee, in viewing the land of the White Point, that is the southernmost tip of the Charleston Peninsula, measuring the breadth of the Ashley River, are of opinion that near the place where the windmill formerly stood is a very proper place to erect a strong fortification, which will entirely command the entrance of Ashley and a great part of the Cook River. And that is exactly where, 2 years later, they built a battery called Broughton's Battery that stood there from 1736 until 1784 at White Point Garden. There's no marker, no evidence, no archaeological investigations down there that have suggested there once was a windmill there. But I think that's where the Dutch wind-powered sawmill got built in 1713, 1714, before the Yamasee War broke. So somewhere down at Charleston's White Point Garden, there should be some kind of a windmill. That's just my opinion. If you're a Molinophile like me, maybe you'll enforce that to the cities. Other windmills, probably the most famous windmill in South Carolina, was actually built outside of Charleston at a place called Cape Romaine. And this was one of the first windmills built by a famous South Carolinian from England named Jonathan Lucas. The name Jonathan Lucas and the name Lucas has long been associated in South Carolina with rice mills. And Jonathan Lucas was a millwright from England. His family had been in the mill business for a long time. Now think about that. In the mill business, you build animal-powered mills, you build water mills, you build windmills, whatever suits the client best. So Lucas brought that technology to Charleston right after the American Revolution. And one of his first commissions, not his very first perhaps, but one of his first was to build a saw windmill for another Englishman named John Bowman at Cape Romaine. And there is not only documentary evidence of that windmill venture, but also physical evidence. So Cape Romaine, let me get you in context here. Charleston's at the bottom of the screen. If you go up the coastline on Highway 17, up towards Georgetown, about halfway in between, is that great natural estuary, that great nature preserve, Cape Romaine. And that's a place that we should all go visit and admire the wildlife that's there. But how do we know there was a windmill? By 1790, that windmill hadn't been erected. It got started in the late 1780s and was probably finished by 1790. Hence this newspaper advertisement, Charleston City Gazette, caution to mariners. The commissioners of pilotage for the Port of Charleston give notice that a windmill has lately been erected on the point of Cape Romaine. So they're basically saying, look out, it's not a lighthouse, it's a windmill. Don't mistake it for a lighthouse or you will land your ship upon the banks of Cape Romaine, much to your great displeasure. So in falling in with this windmill, you must not come into less than 7 fathom waters. If you see the windmill, make an about face to the right, to the left, and head south to Charleston. So that windmill was there for many years, until the 1820s. And it was a landmark that shows up in many navigation books and many navigation maps, pointing out this is a tall windmill, it's a tower windmill, not a lighthouse. Don't mistake it for such. And if you go to Cape Romaine, of course there is a lighthouse today that replaced the windmill many years ago. So here's a map that was published in 1825 by Robert Mills, the Atlas of South Carolina. We've got copies upstairs if you'd like to view it. And it's showing the Cape Romaine area that I'm going to zoom in on here. And if you look closely at this illustration of Cape Romaine, which looks pretty much the same on a modern map, you will notice in the center is the Mill Island. And to this day, it's called Mill Island. Where you see the flashing red dot is apparently where the mill was situated. And right below that on a modern map, you will see, next to Mill Island, you will see Lighthouse Island, so named because that's where the Cape Romaine Lighthouse is today. So there is a proper lighthouse and has been since, I believe, the 1830s. If you're in that vicinity, if you don't happen to be in boat, if you happen to be in a car, the nearest place on land you can get to is McClellanville. And I encourage you all, if you have not before, to visit the village of McClellanville. It's a quaint, picturesque kind of place, but they also have a museum, the Village Museum of McClellanville, that actually has a working model of a windmill. This is Jonathan Lucas's windmill. It's a modern diorama. But this is an artist's conception of what it would have looked like in the 18th century. And they've got really good evidence to base this model on because parts and pieces of Lucas's windmill at Cape Romaine survived. So let me draw your attention to the center of this windmill. Where you see those four arms coming together, there is a central hub. Rather than made out of wood, that entire hub is made out of iron. That is cast iron material. Excuse me, not cast iron, but wrought iron. Pretty high-tech and pretty heavy for that time period. This is something that's created in the late 1780s, early 1790s. And if you were to go inside of the windmill and see the shaft, the iron shaft on the back side of that, and fortunately with this model, you can look inside behind that and see that shaft, the great iron shaft that goes in and attaches to a great wooden wheel. And on the back side of that wooden wheel are cogs. And here they're made out of iron. So this is, again, high-tech stuff. Not wooden carved cogs, but an iron plate on the back of that wheel to transfer that kinetic power down through a system of other gears that mesh with the cogs, down to a cam that, just like in your automobile's engine, the cam rotates and it lifts levers up and down, moving saw blades up and down. And you see the armature going down through the tower to the bottom. And the bottom is a saw workhouse. And if you were to view inside of that, you would see the armature like you see on the picture on the left, bringing this frame up and down, and there are 6 saw blades going up and down. So you put a log in one end, and frame timber comes out the other end. And they've even got a cog mechanism that draws the log across on a conveyor as it's being sawed. It's all mechanized thanks to the windmill. And inside the model, you can actually see they've got a little diorama of that process. It's pretty high-tech machinery for 18th century Europe, let alone South Carolina. And imagine that we had this on the Charleston Peninsula as well. And here's the photograph that I alluded to earlier. This is from the Low Tech Magazine website. Those are 6 vertical saw blades on a modern Dutch windmill, just like the 6-blade sawmill that Jonathan Lucas built at Cape Romaine, just like the Dutch artificers built in the early 1700s on the peninsula of Charleston. You can actually put a log in and get planks out the other end, and then turn those planks 90 degrees and put them back through again, and they get sawed twice, and you get square timbers ready to be used for a house frame. So again, there's the iron hub for the center of that. How do we know it looked like that? Because it survives. The iron axle for that Jonathan Lucas windmill survived in the mud on Mill Island until the 1990s. And we know that it's over 16 and a half feet long. It stands over 6 feet high. And that, I want to just put that in there to give you an idea of the scale. If you go visit the Village Museum, you can actually stand next to it and touch it. That's the center shaft for Jonathan Lucas's wind-powered sawmill from the 1780s. I encourage you to go. The wisteria is in bloom. It's a wonderful place to visit right now. But that's physical evidence of a huge windmill that once was in South Carolina, doing that kind of important work like sawing timbers for houses. Back to the Charleston Peninsula. I mentioned that Jonathan Lucas was an English millwright who had come to South Carolina shortly after the American Revolution. And there was a big resurgence of rebuilding windmills in South Carolina after the American Revolution. Rebuilding of everything. After 8 years of war, there was a long period of rebuilding houses and all kinds of infrastructure in South Carolina. And that included windmills. And Lucas was not the only millwright. He's the most famous millwright. But he's not the only millwright to have come into South Carolina. And we know that because if you look at the newspapers, you see things like this. James Finlayson, who is residing at number 1 Queen Street, advertises that he just arrived from London in 1785, and he's volunteering to and informing the public he's here to build windmills of any kind that you want. So this is his calling card, if you will. If you zoom in, he's got a little post windmill as an illustration. This is the kind of mill that I can build. So please hire me for your work. I have no idea how long Finlayson stayed or how many mills he might have built here. But this is the kind of work that was going on after the American Revolution. So if you look through the local newspapers, really Charleston is the only town right after the American Revolution that has a newspaper in South Carolina. If you look at our newspapers, you can find lots of advertisements. Here's another one from 1790. Cannon and Bennett, that is the two names in early Charleston history that were household names for the contracting and house building business. The Bennett family and the Cannon family. That was their game. They sawed timber and built houses. And they worked hand in hand with bricklayers in Charleston. Both of those families built windmills or hired people like Jonathan Lucas and James Finlayson to build windmills. And they're just announcing in 1790 that they have completed their wind sawmill on the Charleston Peninsula, somewhere over there in the neighborhood of Bennett Street. I'm not sure exactly where that one is, but they will contract for bills of scantling of any dimension for house building, sheathing, 2-inch plank for shipbuilding, and other lumber of any kind. So if you need lumber in South Carolina or anywhere on the coast or the West Indies, you can hire them, and they'll cut lumber with their windmill. And here's another one from 1791. Thomas Bennett, who lives near the windmill, wants 6 pair of good sawyers. And he wants someone immediately well qualified to take charge of a lumber yard, laying out the work for 6 or 8 pairs of sawyers. Also, he wants a lad of about 14 or 15 years of age, willing to serve as an apprentice to the business of a miller, millwright, and lumber measurer. So this is windmill technology. This is building Charleston. And who do you think these pairs of sawyers were? If you think about 18th century Charleston, we're talking about enslaved African American sawyers who are working at the windmill. So this is a great international story. You've got Dutch technology and English immigrants and African labor force. And how do we know? Well, I'll tell you more about the African labor force. Here's another one from 1794. John Webb, who doesn't own the windmill, he's just the supervisor, the overseer at the wind sawmill. He is advertising ranging timber and pine lumber of every kind to be delivered on short notice at Mr. Cannon's windmill. Mr. Cannon's windmill, not sure exactly where that one was. And here's a very interesting advertisement from 1795. Thomas Bennett is announcing at the Charleston Mills, that's the name of his establishment. He has the best pine timber, and also he can contract for a particular lumber. I know this is kind of hard to read. For the West India use, Barbados, Jamaica, what have you in the West Indies, such as windmill arms, points, beams, etc. of the best pine. That is, at his wind-powered sawmill, he's offering to cut wooden parts for other windmills in the West Indies, windmills making windmills here in South Carolina, as well as ship planks and beams. Think about the maritime industry in early South Carolina. How did they cut all these massive oak and pine beams for the ships that were going in and out of Charleston Harbor? Whether they're new ships or old European ships being refit or repaired. They're cutting that timber at the wind-powered sawmill. 1799 is the earliest evidence I can find to prove that African Americans were doing this work. So here's a runaway named Sam. He's about 5 feet 6 inches high, yellowish complexion, formerly owned by Charles Freed. He wants, if you find him, deliver him to the workhouse or to the subscriber, Peter Wyatt, at the brick windmill on Harleston Green. So we've got definitely a tower windmill on the Charleston Peninsula at Harleston's Green. Harleston's Green is still a neighborhood name in Charleston. Some people call it Harleston Village. It was never a village. It's properly called Harleston's Green. And that's 1799. Peter Wyatt, who placed this advertisement, was the overseer and manager of one of those windmills in Charleston and eventually owned a windmill in Charleston. And this is 1799. Another one from a year later, 1800. $10 reward. Ran away from the subscriber Peter Wyatt, a Negro fellow named Jamie. Not Jimmy, Jamie. Jamie's about 5 feet tall, 40 years of age, of the Congo, that is, he is African, speaks broken English, well known in the city by the name of Little Jammy the Sawyer, who's only 5 feet high. He works at the wind power sawmill that's run by Peter Wyatt, the brick windmill on Charleston's Green. Where was that brick windmill? What did it look like? Well, thanks to this map, we have a pretty good idea of where it was. This is a map that was published by a man named Negrin in 1802 with the 1802 edition of the Charleston Directory. So this is a very small map. It's about 8.5 by 11, meant to be folded up inside this pocket directory. And so this is a scan of it. If we zoom in at the uppermost part of the screen, that is the west side of Charleston, on the Ashley River, in Charleston, we will see on Charleston's Green, Wyatt's Windmill. These are crude little illustrations near the corner of Bufane and Ashley Avenue. And there's another windmill near the intersection of Ashley and Gadsden Street. And this one right here, I'm not quite sure about. This is where Thomas Bennett lives, at what is today number 113 Ashley Avenue. A fine house built circa 1802. And I can't tell if that's an illustration of Bennett's house or of Bennett's windmill, because we know Thomas Bennett had a windmill. I'm not sure which of those it is. But if we zoom into those, remember this is a very small illustration, and this is an extreme close-up. You can clearly see that those are meant to be the cross arms of windmills on Charleston's Green, on urban Charleston. How come you haven't heard about these before? Well, they were just commonly seen. Everybody knew they were there. Literally nobody wrote home about them. It was part of daily life in early Charleston. But we have one good illustration, thanks to a local lawyer turned artist named Charles Fraser. And this is a self-portrait of Charles Fraser that you can see at the Gibbs Museum of Art here in Charleston. Around 1802, the same year that Negrin's map was published, he painted a small watercolor scene of the green of Charleston, showing a big tower windmill. Is that Wyatt's tower brick windmill? It probably is. When you zoom in at that, we see, you might say to yourself, well, that can't be Charleston because there's this waterway in front of it. But you have to remember much of Charleston, especially the west side, has been filled in. So what you're looking at is the area immediately west of Colonial Lake. This is 20th century fill, covered with 20th century houses now. And if we zoom in at that windmill, that bucolic, picturesque windmill, this is a Dutch-style timber windmill, much like that model that we just looked at, the mill that Jonathan Lucas built at Cape Romaine. It's got a sawmill below, a brick tower with 4 large arms, high enough up to catch those Ashley River breezes. What happened to that windmill? We don't know exactly, but it was gone by the 1830s. And it was gone because, and this is really the reason for the demise of the windmills in early South Carolina. In the late 18-teens is when the first steam-powered machines made their advent in Charleston. First steam-powered ships, and then steam boilers that could be used on land for a variety of purposes. Whether it was grinding grain or sawing wood or pumping water, steam was the new technology. It seemed cheaper and easier because all you had to do was chop wood and throw it into the fire to boil water to power the machinery with steam. You didn't have to wait for a favorable breeze. You didn't have to rely on skilled labor to manage the windmill, to turn it into the wind, and to maintain all of the complicated machinery. Steam machinery really took off in Charleston in the 1820s. And by the 1830s, these windmills in Charleston are gone from the landscape. But evidence of where they were seems to survive. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate in this 1870 map. If we zoom in at the west side of the peninsula, still Charleston today, we zoom in, we can see next to the pond, which we call Colonial Lake today, in that area, there's still a couple of mills. At the bottom of the stream is Steinmeier's Mill. And that's kind of at the end of Bufane Street, the west end of Bufane Street. That was a steam-powered sawmill. And above that is Halsey's Mill, which was another steam-powered sawmill. The west side of the Charleston Peninsula, up to the 1920s, was just a range of sawmills. First it was windmills, and then later sawmills, up and down the Ashley coast of Charleston. And if you look carefully, near the intersection of Ashley, which on this map is called Lynch Street, near the intersection of Lynch and Wentworth was the site of Wyatt's tall brick windmill. And that was probably a Jonathan Lucas creation. And that's totally forgotten about on this site. But if we look at Halsey's mill, there's a circular structure there where you see the flashing red dot. That may have been Bennett's windmill, near the intersection of Bull Street, or the western end of Bull Street. So if you go out there today, what's that look like? And I encourage you to go out on foot. So if you leave the library today on Calhoun Street and head west over to that side of the neighborhood, and zoom in, what's that look like from a satellite point of view in that area that was Windmill Central 200 years ago? Well, it's all been filled in. It's all 20th century fill, 20th century houses. A very few 19th century houses on what were the highest and driest points at that time. But the red dot right there, let's zoom in at that. That's where Wyatt's windmill was. So just a little bit west and a little bit north of Colonial Lake, between Bufane Street, Wentworth Street, and just a little bit west of Ashley Avenue. Somewhere in that neighborhood was the brick windmill that you see in Charles Fraser's 1802 illustration. I walked by there the other day, and at least from the street, you can't see any evidence that there ever was a windmill. But maybe somewhere in the middle of the block, there's still a brick foundation. And if we zoom back out and look, zoom back out and look at the site of where Bennett's mill was, near the western end of Bull Street, near the intersection of Bull and Gadsden Street. Zoom in at that. Well, that's got fill, but it's relatively undeveloped. That area around Bull Street, Gadsden Street, and especially Barry Street is just about to be developed. There is a new planned development there on Barry Street. So the site of the windmill, which is at just a little bit west of the northwest corner of Bull and Gadsden Streets, may be soon developed. And if you look behind this 20th century townhouse, you'll see a vacant lot. And I'm going to go back to that aerial view for a second. That vacant lot, right there in the middle of the screen, might be exactly where Bennett's windmill was. And there's a little bit of evidence that there might be something circular in nature out there. Maybe it's time for an archaeological investigation. I don't know. It's private property today. But I encourage you to go out on foot and think about windmill territory in Northern Charleston. So to bring this up to the present, I want to just quickly review modern windmills. The steam engine came into power. Windmills became forgotten. They became kind of an anecdote in Charleston's history. But people in general didn't forget about windmills. If you're watching a Western movie or if you've been out to the plains of America, you think about these kinds of windmills, which were made in the 19th century and early 20th century for pumping water in places where it was very difficult to drill wells. And here's one from Wikipedia showing a very stereotypical kind of view of a Western American windmill. Well, we had those kind of wind-powered water pumps here in the Low Country as well. Here's a 1970 photograph of a wind-powered pump. This is a late 19th century, early 20th century wind-powered water pump on Wadmalaw Island, and I think it's still there. And if we zoom in, I know this is kind of hard to see, but there's a water, kind of a collecting barrel here at the bottom, pumping water using the kinetic power of the wind to pump water out and store it in that water tank. So in places like Wadmalaw and James Island, Johns Island, where it's hard to get water to perk, it's very difficult to have a well, wind power technology was the answer. But in the news today, when we think about windmills, we really hear about wind turbines. And this is the face of the 21st century windmill, the large offshore wind turbine. And these are huge, costly, high-tech machines off the coastline to harness those ocean breezes and bring the technology back to the coastline. And as this newspaper photo shows from the Post and Courier in 2013, which really kind of sparked my interest in doing this program, the Clemson University has invested in this wind turbine testing facility at the old Charleston Navy base. And they've got a multinational venture with a large amount of money. This is the largest wind turbine testing facility in the world. Now, they're not talking about putting wind turbines off the coast of South Carolina, but they're testing the technology here for people around the world. So they're testing machinery that may be placed off the coast of of the northeast of America or off the coast of Holland or England. And we're talking about very large, costly machinery. And with this photograph, you get an idea of the scale of these machines. This is the turbine meant to generate electricity from these offshore facilities. These are huge in scale compared to what are tiny in comparison 18th century windmills. And again, maybe off the coast of South Carolina, we're not going to have these, but the technology is being tested, and the technology is part of South Carolina's history. So I really encourage you to, if you're interested in this topic, to come up the stairs to the South Carolina room to explore more of our windmill history. And remember these parting thoughts. So in conclusion, remember that early colonists to South Carolina brought familiar tools with them to the New World. And that included windmill technology. That was something that they would have been used to seeing in Europe, and they brought with them. Windmills flourished while they were economically viable throughout the 17th and 18th century and into the 19th century. But once the steam engine came online, by the 1830s, it is the latest, greatest technology. Everybody is getting rid of their wind-powered machinery and their water-powered machinery and converting to steam-powered machinery. Kinetic wind turbines are once again economically relevant. Windmills are now economically relevant. It's all come full circle. And I don't know about you, but as a newfound Molinophile, I think that wind turbines offer a new, fun way for us to connect with our past here in South Carolina. So I hope you've enjoyed this tour of early windmill technology. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to entertain any questions if anybody might have them. Walter.
How, as that was cutting edge technology for a long time, how literate or numerate did the workers in those mills have to be?
That's a really good question. How literate or how well with numerate, how well with numbers?
You know, how they did with the math of it.
Because sawing timber involves an awful lot of math, and it's a highly skilled trade. So if you think about the workforce for South Carolina windmills being mostly African-American slaves, these would have been skilled slaves in the scale of range of labor, from unskilled manual labor to highly skilled artisan labor. There were slaves in Charleston, or enslaved men that ran the gamut from no skill to highly skilled. So windmill technology and being a sawyer, like Jamie the sawyer was, puts them at the upper end of the range with, I would say, with house carpenters, maybe not with watchmakers, as being highly skilled and trade that requires a great deal of training. But it's something that does require an apprenticeship and something that requires a nimble mind to be able to work with your hands and think quickly. And to what extent that was written down, to what extent they learned by doing on-the-job training is something we can explore.
Just because I'm trying to follow that up because of the conflict between a skill or a trade that might require you to read against a system which, you know, we're talking about 195 years of slavery here, so I know it waxes and it wanes in terms of like how fierce and how much anxiety there is over slaves being literate.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to get a sense of somebody working in a mill. Would he have to read an order, or would he just be instructed, be that heavily instructed or overseen?
Well, I think one way to think about that might be to think about 20th century millwrights. People the vintage of our grandparents or great-grandparents who knew people who worked at mills, and white or black, those mill workers mostly illiterate or have limited education. So there's probably not a lot of requirement for them to do math or to be able to read an order. Certainly at these windmills in Charleston, from the evidence we have, there appear to be white overseers or managers, foremen, who are directing a staff of 6 or 8 pairs of sawyers like we saw here. So there's someone who's reading the orders and communicating the orders verbally. And that's that's probably the mechanism. But now that we know that these windmills existed, and now that we know there were enslaved men working at them, we can try to identify some of the names and maybe explore that further to try to identify how skilled these people were. I mean, it opens up a new avenue of research in Charleston history. Ralph, did you have a question?
No, sorry.
Okay. Terry? Terry Lynn?
Why wouldn't they take and just move the steam engines into the existing mills with the gears and the cams already there? Why would they build a whole brand new?
Okay, so the question is, why would the steam engines start from scratch and abandon the windmill? Why not recycle some of the infrastructure, recycle some of the equipment? And they may have, but it depends on how the apparatus is set up. So a windmill, by definition, kind of has a vertical mechanism. And with the steam-powered mechanism, you've got a steam boiler that's on the ground, and it's turning wheels. It's creating kinetic energy with the steam to turn wheels, and you have mostly horizontal shafts and ropes and pulleys or belts coming off of that horizontal shaft to turn. So literally the whole industry was reoriented. And one anecdote that I didn't put in the program, Jonathan Lucas's grandson, who was operating sawmills in Charleston in the 1830s, says in his memoirs, my grandfather built windmills, and there was one on the peninsula that I pushed over and recycled the bricks for my steam-powered sawmill. So the materials probably did get entirely recycled, but they had to be reoriented. Yes, ma'am?
You mentioned early on the Dutch book from 1734 that's in the library's collection.
Yeah.
Does that have a local provenance? Do you know how it came to be?
The 1734 Dutch windmill book that we have is in our archive. It's not in the catalog right now. But my hope is, before the end of the year, to completely digitize it and put it online with a translation. I'm learning Dutch, so I can do that. I'm totally fascinated by it. How it got to Charleston, I do not know. How long it's been in Charleston, I have no provenance information on it at all. On the back of a couple of sheets, and these are large sheets, fold-out plates, copper plate engravings pressed into the paper. On a couple of these sheets, someone scribbled on the back of them as if they had them on a work table and were saying, well, let's do something like this. Whether that was done in Holland or whether that was done here, I have no idea. But there were certainly Dutch people here, and as the evidence shows, there were at least 30 Dutch artisans who came here specifically to build windmills. Some of them stayed, some of them left. But you don't think about Dutch immigrants in early South Carolina so much, but there certainly were some. There was the Van Velsen family, who came here from New York in the 1690s. And of course, there's the Van der Horst or Van Dross family. And there are other Dutch families that came and went and are long forgotten in Charleston history. But maybe we can pin that down, and maybe it's possible to establish some kind of conjectural provenance for it. But unfortunately, we don't have it. Yes, O.C.
Any kind of idea of the cost of a windmill in today's dollars?
Yeah, that's a good question. How much in today's dollars would a windmill cost in early South Carolina? Well, Samuel Ragg says he spent 1,500 pounds sterling, but that money was to transport 30 Dutchmen to South Carolina, and they built one windmill. How much of that 1,500 pounds sterling in 1713 was used for the actual windmill? That's a good question. Maybe in this Dutch windmill book, it'll have some figures in it. I haven't translated anything that suggests numbers. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, if I were to want to build a windmill today, how would I approach it? And, there was a man that had a farm near me. He had a windmill, produced all the electricity that he needed, and he sold the rest back to the electric company. That was interesting. And it was there till the 80s, 1980s.
And where was that?
It's in McLean, Virginia,
Okay.
where I grew up outside of D.C. He owned a farm, and he owned all the land around it. And I used to talk to the guy, and it's like his great-grandfather built it in the 19th century. And I'd like to build one.
Well, I encourage you to do that. So,
What do you think? I don't want to build like a turbine, like a multi-million-dollar, just enough to produce electricity from it.
Right. Well, if you wanted to, anybody who wants to build a windmill today, how do you get started? Well, you could look at existing plans like Jan Ziel's book and see, they're basically schematics. They're basically blueprints for how to build it. It's a timber frame structure. It has all wooden parts with some iron parts as well. The technology still exists to do that, whether you want to build a post mill or smock or a tower mill, but also consider those late 19th, early 20th century water mills that were mass produced in the United States for pumping water. Those things are being kind of brought back to life, and there are people who are, again, mass producing those kinds of small wind turbines. And there's some confusion in the terminology. There are vertical windmills and horizontal windmills today, as there were 300 years ago. There was a man in Charleston in the 1790s who offered to build horizontal windmills. That thing that spins this way for the wind. Basically, it's just a big fan. So those kind of things, you can find plans for them on the internet. On the peninsula of Charleston, we're in a conundrum here because in a historic district, the Board of Architectural Review won't let us build windmills. But that's, maybe we can convince them otherwise because there's historic precedent. But if you live off the peninsula, especially if you live in rural South Carolina, near the coast, then yes, you could build a windmill. If you can get above the tree line, you can harness some good wind and turn that back into energy. And so just like with solar power, there could be or should be incentives out there from the electric company, from the government, to take part in these kind of endeavors. And I think, as a historian, that if we can connect with the past and say, wait a minute, there used to be windmills here, and yes, it used to be a viable part of the South Carolina industry, then it might give even more impetus to kickstarting those kind of ventures. So you're right, you don't have to go on the multi-billion-dollar end of the scale. But for small residential, personal kind of uses, I think it's a great idea. Yes, Carl?
There's one windmill on James Island, and I was told it wasn't just built as a decoration, it was built as a workshop,
Oh,
and it actually powered the workshop.
I cut this out of my presentation in the interest of time. But yes, there are a couple of windmills on James Island. I'm told near Fort Johnson there is an old water pump windmill that's in disrepair, but I haven't seen it yet. But if you go to the public access boat landing, Riverland Terrace, on Wapu Cut, there is a 20-foot tall windmill, Dutch-style smock windmill, that was built in the 1930s out of plans from Popular Mechanics magazine. And it was used, and it wasn't built originally at that site. It got moved a decade ago. Robert Baer with the Post and Courier wrote an article about it a few years ago. But it was built on the Stono River side of James Island as a water pumping mechanism. And upstairs in our archive, we actually have 1958 color photograph of that windmill on the Stono River. And you can see that photograph in the Low Country Digital Library. It was built as a water pumping device, but now it's purely decorative near the fire station in Riverland Terrace. Is that the one you were thinking of?
It was on Elliott's Cut, and they moved it about 30 years ago when I first moved here.
Okay, so it got moved about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Related to the
It's the
Judson
same
line.
guy that built the Spirit of South Carolina. It's on his property. By Cochran.
Oh, interesting,
Not
kind
Spirit,
of maritime
but,
connection.
The tour boat, not the Spirit tour boat.
Oh,
The Pride?
the schooner Pride,
Yeah.
so the same family
It
is
was
associated
next to their house before Hugo.
before
And
Hurricane
it was
Hugo.
moved after.
Yeah, it was 25 years ago this year. Hurricane. Other questions? Thought I saw another. Yes, sir.
Looking at the iron shaft from the Lucas Mill at Cape Romaine, that looks like something that would have been imported. But much of the machinery you're showing looks like wood and could have been scratch built here. And so I'm wondering what that might say about the industrial capacity of the Low Country
Yeah, I think-
at the time.
I think that this windmill evidence speaks very highly of the industrial capacity of 18th and 19th century South Carolina. And with regards to the windmill at Cape Romaine that Jonathan Lucas built, that 16-foot-long iron shaft, was that imported? Was it locally created? I don't know, and maybe there is some Lucas family archive that will tell us that. I'm not sure. But I found an interesting thing while trolling through the newspapers. Again, another thing I've cut in the interest of time. In the late 1780s, again, after the American Revolution, there is a full-page advertisement in the Charleston newspaper. I can't remember the exact year, maybe 1787, something like that, for the Etna and Era Iron Works, which is up in the upstate of South Carolina, near the North Carolina border. It was an established iron foundry and really the premier iron works in early South Carolina. It was up for sale, the whole 15,000 acres, and the 70 or 80 enslaved men on the plantation. And they didn't have a windmill because it's inland South Carolina near the North Carolina border. But it said that they have the capacity for building any type of ironware that might be needed for any kind of industry. And this is right after the American Revolution. And it says all those people who are rebuilding windmills are going to need parts. And you could supply them if you purchased the Etna and Era ironworks. So I get that opens, for my mind, that opens the door to the possibility that maybe that 16.5-foot iron shaft was crafted in South Carolina. If it was, that's an incredible feat of technology for 18th century South Carolina. In the interest of time, I'm going to draw things to a close, but I want to remind you, besides thanking you for your patience, and thank you for coming since this program got delayed from January to April. If you want to come to other programs that I'm doing, you want to see what other kind of programs I've got in my sleeve, don't forget to check out this new website, the Charleston Time Machine. Hopefully that's easy to remember, just Time Machine, charlestontimemachine.org. Sign yourself up and you'll get all the latest news about the crazy programs that we do. Thank you very much, everyone.